Before we start, hit the subscribe button. This channel is built to recover the old work, forgotten trades, and survival economies that rarely make it into schoolbooks. In 1933, the American job market broke. Factories were quiet. Banks had failed. Farm prices had collapsed. Men who had spent their whole lives working suddenly stood in breadlines with nothing in their pockets but folded newspapers and shame. At the worst point of the Great Depression, government labor statistics put unemployment near 1 in 4 workers. 1 in 4, no paycheck, no job board, no rideshare app, no online store, no emergency loan from a phone screen. And still, people found ways to survive. They sold apples from crates on frozen sidewalks. They turned back bedrooms into boarding rooms. They washed clothes until their hands split. They dug roots from mountain soil, cut ice from frozen lakes, shined shoes in train stations, sold eggs from backyard hens, and stitched garments under dim apartment lights while their children slept beside the work. Some of these jobs were honest. Some were illegal. Some were dangerous. Some were so useful that corporations and governments later copied the model, took the profit, and pushed the original workers out. This is not a story about how poverty was good. It was not. Poverty was cold rooms, bad teeth, unpaid rent, and children learning too early what adults were afraid of. But this is a story about resourcefulness. Before work became a resume, a manager, a time clock, and a password, people made money from what they had. A spare bed, a strong back, a recipe, a flock of hens, a wagon, a sewing machine, a patch of woods, or simply the courage to stand on a corner and sell. These are 20 forgotten ways Americans made money when the official economy had no place for them. Before the countdown, one rule matters. The old economy was not one economy. It was a patchwork. A family might take in a boarder, sell eggs, mend clothes, cut wood in winter, and send a child to collect bottles after school. None of those pieces looked like a career by itself. Together, they could keep a household alive. That is why these stories are easy to miss. Official records were built around wages, factories, farms, banks, taxes, and employers. But poor households often survived in the gaps between those systems. A coin earned at the kitchen table, a meal sold from the back door, a room rented quietly, a route walked before dawn, a skill traded for groceries, a risk taken because the rent was due on Friday. Modern people often ask, what did they do for work? The better question is, what did they do for money? Those answers are messier, more human, and much harder to count. Number 20, selling what everyone else threw away. Before recycling was a municipal service, it was a street economy. In American cities, rag pickers, junk men, bone collectors, bottle collectors, and scrap dealers moved through alleys before the city fully woke up. They carried sacks, baskets, hooks, handcarts, and sometimes horse-drawn wagons. To the respectable classes, they looked like poverty. To factories and middlemen, they were suppliers. Old cotton and wool rags could be sold into paper mills or textile reuse. Bones could go to glue works, fertilizer makers, button factories, and other industrial buyers. Bottles could be washed and reused. Metal could be sold by the pound and melted back into usefulness. The job required almost no capital, which is exactly why it mattered. A person did not need a storefront. They did not need a boss. They did not need a bank account. They needed a route, a buyer, and the willingness to touch the things everyone else pretended had no value. In immigrant neighborhoods, children helped sort materials. Women separated cloth by quality. Men pushed carts from yard to yard and alley to alley. It was dirty, badly paid, and often despised. But it was also one of the first economic ladders available to families who had arrived with nothing. City sanitation departments and reformers eventually pushed much of this world out of sight. The language changed. Junk became waste management. Rag picking became recycling. Scrap became an industry. But the principle did not change. The old economy understood something modern people forget. A thing is not worthless just because someone with money is finished with it. Pause here because this first group has a pattern. The easiest old hustles started with something already nearby. Waste in the alley, fruit in a crate, a spare room, a root in the woods, a stove already burning, a frozen pond. These were not scalable startups. They were conversions. They converted leftovers, space, weather, skill, and local knowledge into cash. That matters because people in hard times rarely begin with a clean slate. They begin with constraints. They begin with children at home, a sick parent, no transport, no credit, no credential, and no promise that tomorrow will be better. The genius of these old strategies was not that they were glamorous. It was that they lowered the first step. You did not need permission to notice that bottles had value. You did not need a corporate account to rent a room. You did not need a factory badge to bake food someone wanted. You needed trust, repetition, and the nerve to ask for money in a world that often expected poor people to be grateful for scraps. This is also why many of these trades created conflict. Once a survival strategy became visible, cities, companies, reformers, and licensed professions started asking who should control it. Sometimes the answer improved safety. Sometimes it protected customers. Sometimes it simply pushed small operators out and handed the market to people with paperwork. Number 19. Selling apples on the street. The photograph is almost too perfect. A tired man in a worn coat, standing beside a wooden crate, selling apples for a nickel. During the Great Depression, that image became one of the symbols of American collapse. But the apple sellers were not only symbols. They were part of a real survival trade. After the 1929 crash, apple growers and distributors were stuck with surplus fruit. The International Apple Shippers Association helped place apples into the hands of unemployed men who could sell them from street corners. Contemporary accounts described thousands of apple sellers in New York City alone. The business model was brutally simple. Get a crate, stand somewhere with foot traffic, sell each apple for a few cents. Hope weather, police, shopkeepers, and hunger did not beat you before sunset. For some men, a good day meant enough for a bed in a lodging house and a hot meal. For others, it meant 10 hours in the cold and almost nothing to show for it. But the apple crate gave them one thing the breadline could not: the public appearance of trade. They were not begging. They were selling. That mattered in a culture that treated unemployment like a personal failure, even when millions had lost work at the same time. Eventually, the apple seller became a cliché, even a joke in newspapers and cartoons. But behind the image was a hard truth. When the formal economy collapsed, a man could still stand on a corner with 60 apples and try to turn shame into supper. Number 18. Taking in boarders. Today, renting out a room sounds like a platform feature. In the old economy, it was ordinary household survival. Before suburban zoning, modern leases, and strict single-family ideals, American homes were often flexible economic spaces. A spare bedroom could become income. So could an attic, a converted parlor, or a small room near the kitchen. Boarders were everywhere in industrial America. Single factory workers, miners, school teachers, clerks, traveling salesmen, immigrants saving money, and widowers who needed a table as much as a bed. The arrangement often included meals, laundry, heat, and family life. A boarder might eat breakfast before the mill whistle, leave coins on Friday, and become familiar enough that children remembered his stories for the rest of their lives. For women, especially widows, boarding could be the difference between keeping a house and losing it. A woman with rooms to rent could convert domestic labor into rent money. She cooked, cleaned, changed linens, kept order, and ran what was essentially a small business from her front door. Boarding also helped workers move. A young man from a farm could arrive in Pittsburgh, Lowell, Chicago, or Detroit and find a bed before he found a permanent life. The boarding house was part hotel, part family, part labor infrastructure. After World War II, rising privacy expectations, suburban mortgages, zoning codes, and the ideal of the nuclear family made boarding seem old-fashioned or suspicious. The house became less of an economic tool and more of a private consumption space. But for generations, a spare room was not spare. It was insurance. Number 17. Digging wild ginseng. Deep in Appalachian woods, a family could find money growing under shade. American ginseng is a slow-growing plant with a valuable root. Demand from Asian markets reaches back to the 1700s, when traders realized that the American species could be exported across the Pacific. In mountain communities with little cash, that root became a seasonal lifeline. Digging ginseng was called sanging. It required knowledge that rarely appeared in books: which slopes were cool enough, which hollows had the right shade, how to spot the red berries, how to dig without breaking the root, how to dry it so a buyer would pay more. Children learned by walking behind parents and grandparents. The forest became a map of family memory. A good season could buy winter supplies, flour, salt, shoes, cloth, ammunition, medicine. For households locked out of factories and far from cities, ginseng connected mountain poverty to international trade. It also created a conservation problem. Valuable wild plants are easy to overharvest. By the 20th century, wild ginseng was increasingly scarce, and today the trade is regulated to protect the species. That tension is part of the story. Survival economies often use whatever is closest. Sometimes that is a spare room. Sometimes it is a skillet. Sometimes it is a plant that takes years to grow and minutes to remove. The people digging were not thinking about global supply chains. They were thinking about winter. Number 16. Selling food from home kitchens. Long before food trucks and delivery apps, American women sold food from kitchens, baskets, carts, windows, porches, and street corners. This was especially important in communities where formal jobs were closed, underpaid, or unstable. Black women in southern cities sold pies, cakes, fried foods, and prepared plates. Mexican-American women sold tamales from carts and baskets across Texas, California, and the Southwest. Immigrant families sold breads, pickles, soups, sausages, pastries, and hot meals tied to the food traditions they carried with them. The business model was simple enough to understand and hard enough to respect. Wake early, cook in quantity, carry food where workers passed, sell before it cooled, reinvest in ingredients, repeat tomorrow. A pie was not just a pie, it was rent. A dozen tamales was not just dinner. It was a schoolbook, coal, medicine, or a landlord delayed one more week. The power of this work was that it turned domestic skill into money without needing a factory job. A woman could feed her household and the neighborhood from the same stove. But as cities professionalized food safety, they also raised the barrier to entry. Commercial kitchens, permits, inspections, and licensing could protect public health, but they could also price out the poorest cooks. Today's cottage food laws and home bakery movements are often treated as new opportunities. They are really a return to an older American habit. When cash was short, the kitchen became a storefront. Number 15. Cutting ice from frozen lakes. Before refrigerators, ice was not a convenience. It was infrastructure. In winter, men walked onto frozen lakes and rivers with saws, pikes, horses, sledges, and ropes. They cut the ice into blocks, floated it through channels, hauled it to ice houses, and packed it in sawdust so it would last into summer. The work was cold, heavy, and dangerous. A horse could slip, a man could fall through, hands froze, blades cut. But in farming regions, ice work arrived at exactly the right time, when fields were asleep and cash was scarce. Natural ice became a major American industry in the 19th century. Ice moved by rail and shipped to cities, hotels, breweries, meat packers, restaurants, homes, and warm regions far from the frozen ponds where it began. For a farmer with access to a good pond, winter ice could mean wages when crops brought nothing. For laborers, it was seasonal employment. For towns, ice houses were as important as barns. Then mechanical refrigeration changed the equation. The old ice trade did not slowly evolve. It collapsed. Ice houses rotted, cutting tools rusted, lakes that had once been winter workplaces became quiet scenery. This is one of the recurring patterns in the old economy. A skill can be essential for a century and obsolete in a generation. The people who built their lives around it rarely get invited to the future. First pattern break. Here is where the story gets sharper. The next jobs were not just forgotten. Some were absorbed, regulated, or copied by the very institutions that once condemned them. Number 14. Taking in laundry. Laundry was one of the most important income sources available to poor American women, especially black women after the Civil War. It was brutal work. Clothes were soaked, boiled, scrubbed on washboards, rinsed, wrung, starched, dried, and pressed with heavy irons heated on a stove. Water had to be hauled. Fires had to be kept. Hands cracked. Arms burned. Steam filled kitchens in summer heat. But laundry gave women something rare: control. A washerwoman could often work from home. She could set her own rhythm. She could take in customers, negotiate, involve family labor, and avoid a white employer's kitchen or a factory floor. In Atlanta, in 1881, black washerwomen turned that quiet power into open labor action. Thousands organized and demanded a standard rate of $1 per dozen pounds of wash. City leaders threatened fines. Employers panicked. The strike revealed how much urban comfort depended on women whose work was supposed to remain invisible. That is why laundry belongs high on this list. It was not just a chore, it was an economy. And in some places, it became politics. Automatic washing machines and commercial laundries later changed the trade. The home washerwoman faded from the center of urban life. But for decades, a tub, a fire, soap, and endurance allowed women with few formal rights to command cash from households that depended on them. The washboard was a tool of labor. In the right hands, it was also leverage. Number 13. Running the numbers. In Harlem, Chicago, Detroit, and black neighborhoods across America, the numbers game was an illegal lottery. But it was also a job system, a credit network, and a neighborhood economy. The rules were easy. A player picked a 3-digit number and placed a small bet with a runner. The winning number was usually tied to a public source, such as racing or financial figures, so players believed the outcome could not be easily manipulated. A bet could be tiny, a penny, a nickel, a dime, but multiplied across a neighborhood, those coins became serious money. The numbers economy employed runners, collectors, clerks, guards, and bankers. Stephanie St. Clair, known as Madam Queen, became one of Harlem's most famous operators. She used her money and public voice to fight rivals, expose corruption, and defend her position in a world that tried to exclude black wealth from legitimate channels. The numbers game was illegal and it could be exploitative, but it also existed because mainstream banks, insurers, and employers shut many people out. In that vacuum, the street built its own financial circuits. The irony is impossible to miss. Later, state lotteries adopted a similar basic idea: small bets, numbered tickets, long odds, public legitimacy. When the state ran it, the language changed. It was no longer a racket, it was revenue. Sometimes the line between crime and policy is not the product, it is who gets the license. This is the third pattern. Many old hustles were built on trust at close range. The washerwoman needed repeat customers. The food seller needed neighbors who believed her kitchen was clean. The midwife needed families who trusted her hands. The boarder needed a household willing to let a stranger sleep under its roof. The numbers runner needed players who believed the game would pay when it hit. That trust was local, personal, and fragile. It could protect people, but it could also trap them. A good reputation was currency. A bad rumor could end a business. A dishonest buyer could cheat someone with no lawyer. A customer could refuse payment. A police officer could decide a cart, a basket, or a corner was suddenly a problem. Modern platforms replaced some of that local trust with ratings, profiles, payment processors, insurance terms, and dispute systems. That looks cleaner. In some ways, it is cleaner, but it also means the gatekeeper moved. The old boarding house owner answered to neighbors and police. The modern host answers to a platform, a city rule, an algorithm, and a payment account. The old economy was not freer in every way. It was simply governed by different powers. Number 12. Selling blood. There was a time when a desperate person could turn a pint of blood into cash. For much of the 20th century, America had both volunteer and paid blood systems. Commercial blood banks operated in some cities, and paid donation became associated with poor men, skid rows, boarding houses, and people who needed money immediately. The exchange was intimate and harsh. Walk in weak, walk out weaker, but with enough cash for rent, food, or another night indoors. Critics argued that paid blood systems attracted donors who were more likely to be sick, desperate, or dishonest about risk. The safety debate grew, especially around hepatitis and contaminated blood. Richard Titmuss's 1970 book, The Gift Relationship, made the moral argument famous by comparing blood as a market commodity with blood as a social gift. The system shifted. Paid whole blood for transfusion became heavily restricted, while volunteer blood became the standard in hospitals. But compensation did not vanish from the body economy. Plasma donation remained legal and expanded into a major industry. Today, plasma collected from paid donors supports pharmaceutical products around the world. That is the uncomfortable pattern. When the poor sold blood directly, society called it dangerous. When corporations built a medical supply chain around compensated plasma, the same human need became organized, regulated, and profitable. The old hustle did not disappear. It was professionalized. Number 11. Distilling whiskey off the books. Moonshine was not invented by Prohibition. Prohibition made it famous. For farmers, whiskey had a practical logic. Corn was bulky and often cheap. Distilled into whiskey, It became more valuable, easier to transport, easier to store, and easier to trade. On the frontier, whiskey could function almost like money. That is why the Whiskey Rebellion of the 1790s mattered. A federal tax on distilled spirits struck directly at rural producers who saw whiskey as survival economics, not luxury. The tradition never disappeared. Families in Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, and other rural regions operated stills long before the 18th Amendment. Prohibition simply turned an old rural practice into a national black market. During the 1920s, illegal alcohol supported layers of work: distillers, sugar suppliers, drivers, lookouts, bartenders, barrel makers, corrupt officials, and mechanics who modified cars for speed. That last detail changed American culture. Cars built to outrun law enforcement on back roads helped feed the stock car racing world that later became NASCAR. The risk was real. Raids, prison, violence, explosions, poisoned liquor, and betrayal were part of the trade. But the incentive was also real. When government outlawed a product millions still wanted, it created a market for anyone willing to break the rule. Moonshining was crime. It was also rural arithmetic. Second pattern break. The next section is about jobs with almost no gatekeeper, no office, no application, no permission beyond finding a customer. Number 10. Trapping and selling fur. Long after the big fur companies faded from frontier history, individual trappers still made money from winter woods and wetlands. A farm boy could run a trap line before school. A father could check creek banks before chores. Muskrat, mink, raccoon, fox, beaver, and other pelts could be skinned, stretched, dried, and sold to local fur buyers. The work rewarded knowledge. A trapper had to read tracks, water levels, trails, dens, weather, bait, and animal habits. A pelt handled badly lost value. A trap set carelessly wasted time or caused suffering without profit. For rural families, fur money could be the difference between having cash and having only crops. It paid for feed, taxes, ammunition, Christmas gifts, or school clothes. It also fit the calendar. Winter was hard, but it opened the trap line. The trade declined for many reasons: changing fashion, suburban growth, habitat loss, synthetic materials, and rising opposition to fur. Traveling fur buyers who once drove county roads became rare. But trapping shows how old household economies worked. People did not rely on one income stream. They stacked them. Eggs, firewood, trapping, roots, odd jobs, boarders, repairs, sewing, food sales. Today that is called diversification. Back then, it was just how a family avoided ruin. Number 9. Shining shoes. A shoe shine box was one of the cheapest businesses in the city. A wooden stand, brushes, polish, rags, and a good corner could become a workplace. Shoe shiners operated outside train stations, hotels, office buildings, barber shops, and busy sidewalks. The customer sat down with dusty leather. A few minutes later, he walked away polished. The fee might be a nickel, a dime, or more depending on the period and place. Tips could matter more than the posted price. Location mattered most of all. A corner near a station or hotel could mean steady traffic from commuters, clerks, lawyers, salesmen, and businessmen. For immigrant boys, black men, and poor children, shoe shining required little capital but demanded social skill. You had to call out, read faces, work fast, flatter without groveling, and make a stranger feel important for the length of a shine. The stand was also an information booth. Shoe shiners heard gossip, politics, business talk, police news, and rumors from men who forgot the person polishing their shoes was listening. Some shiners used the trade as a first rung. Others stayed in it because no better door opened. The profession faded as sneakers, casual clothes, and synthetic shoes replaced leather dress shoes in everyday life. The box disappeared, but for decades, it was proof that a business could begin with a brush and a corner. Number 8. Selling patent medicines. Before the Food and Drug Administration had real power, medicine was partly chemistry and partly theater. Patent medicine sellers traveled with bottles of tonics, bitters, syrups, liniments, pills, and miracle cures. Their labels promised relief from coughs, nerves, baldness, weakness, pain, stomach trouble, and almost everything else a human body could fear. Some formulas contained alcohol, some contained opiates or stimulants, some contained little more than flavoring, color, and confidence. The product mattered, but the show sold it. Medicine peddlers used wagons, music, comedy, magic tricks, testimonials, and planted customers. A rural town could become a stage. The crowd came for entertainment and left with a bottle. This was not harmless. Many products were fraudulent, addictive, or dangerous. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was a major step toward forcing labels and reducing deception. But as an old hustle, patent medicine shows reveal one of the most durable facts in business. People pay for hope, especially when real care is scarce or expensive. The traveling medicine man did not disappear. He changed clothes. Today, the same emotional sale can appear in miracle supplements, online cures, anti-aging funnels, and wellness promises dressed in scientific language. Different bottle, same fear. Number 7. Midwifery and community healing. Before hospitals became the default place to give birth, the local midwife was often the closest thing a community had to a health system. Midwives delivered babies, cared for mothers, treated fevers, brewed remedies, set simple injuries, and knew which family needed help before anyone wrote it on a chart. In many rural, immigrant, Black, and poor communities, they were trusted because they were present. In the early 1900s, midwives attended a large share of American births. In some communities, especially in the rural South, Black granny midwives were essential. Their knowledge was learned through apprenticeship, observation, memory, and experience. Payment could be cash, but it could also be food, labor, cloth, chickens, or credit. The midwife's fee was often far less than a doctor's, and the care was local. Then medicine professionalized, hospitals expanded, doctors organized, licensing laws tightened. Public health campaigns often portrayed midwives as backward or unsafe. Some reforms improved outcomes. Some removed skilled community women from work they had performed for generations. The change was medical, but it was also economic. Women who had earned authority through care were displaced by institutions that could charge, certify, and control. The modern return of midwifery is not a brand new invention. It is a rediscovery of work that never lacked value. It only lost official permission. Number 6. Cutting and selling firewood. For most of American history, heat was something you stacked. A man with an axe, crosscut saw, wagon, and access to trees could turn labor into fuel and fuel into cash. Families without land needed wood. Boarding houses needed wood. Schools, stores, kitchens, and workshops needed wood. This work fit the rural year. When fields were quiet, woodlots became workplaces. Fathers felled trees. Sons split rounds. Mothers and daughters stacked, counted, traded, or helped load the wagon. A cord of hardwood was not just a pile. It was warmth, cooking, survival, and money. In winter, the person who could deliver wood had something every household understood. The work was repetitive and punishing. Blisters, strained backs, dull blades, wet boots, and bad weather were part of the job, but it required no diploma and little permission. If you had tools and timber, you had a product. Coal, oil, gas, and electric heat eventually changed the market. Firewood remained, but its role shifted. What had been a necessity became backup heat, rural habit, or fireplace atmosphere. The old wood cellar faded because the household energy system changed. Here is the second pattern. Seasonal work was not a side issue. It was the calendar of survival. Ice cutting belonged to winter. Ginseng belonged to fall. Trapping belonged to cold months. Firewood filled the gaps when fields were quiet. Laundry and food sales filled weekly cash needs. Boarders paid on a rhythm. Eggs arrived day after day. A household did not think in annual salary. It thought in intervals. What brings money this week? What carries us through winter? What can be sold before the landlord comes? What can the children help with after school? What can be done without leaving the house? That kind of thinking produced a different relationship to work. Work was not always a place. It was a set of opportunities attached to seasons, rooms, tools, routes, and relationships. The old economy was hard partly because it never stopped. The kitchen was a kitchen, but also a bakery, a laundry, a boarding house dining room, and sometimes a sewing floor. The woods were woods, but also a pharmacy, a fur market, a fuel source, and a place where a child learned what could be sold. When industrial jobs became the ideal, this older rhythm began to look backward. But the rhythm did not disappear because it was stupid. It disappeared because factories, zoning, licensing, appliances, supermarkets, central heating, and mass distribution changed what small households could compete with. But the lesson remains: the most basic human needs create the most durable markets. Cold people buy heat. Hungry people buy food. Tired people buy labor. Third pattern break. The final stretch gets closer to the hidden economy: grief, scrap, illegal demand, household independence, and the quiet work done after dark. Number 5. Fortune-telling and spiritualism. After the Civil War, America was full of grief. Hundreds of thousands of families had lost sons, husbands, fathers, and brothers. Many never received a body. Many never received certainty. Into that grief stepped spiritualists, mediums, and fortune-tellers. Spiritualism promised communication with the dead. For skeptics, it was fraud. For believers, it was comfort. For many women, it was also work. Mediums hosted seances, gave private readings, toured lecture halls, published messages, and charged fees. At a time when respectable public income for women was limited, spiritualism opened a strange door. A woman could speak in public, command a room, and earn money through performance, intuition, belief, and emotional intelligence. Some mediums were sincere. Some were tricksters. Many probably lived in the gray area between faith, theater, and survival. Cities passed ordinances against fortune-telling and treated it as fraud or disorder, but demand did not disappear. It moved indoors, behind curtains, into parlors and private referrals. This belongs in the old economy because it shows that people do not only buy goods, they buy reassurance. When life becomes uncertain, certainty itself becomes a product. That was true in a candlelit seance room. It is still true now. Number 4. Collecting scrap metal. Scrap metal was the hard-edged version of recycling. Old parts, broken tools, wire, bed frames, pipe, brass fittings, copper scraps, machinery parts, tin cans, anything that could be melted, repaired, stripped, or resold had value. In industrial neighborhoods, junk dealers bought by weight and sold upward to foundries, mills, and larger yards. Children searched vacant lots. Men pushed carts through alleys. Families saved metal until there was enough to make a trip worthwhile. During the Great Depression, scrap collecting became a lifeline for some of the unemployed. During the World Wars, scrap became patriotic. Government drives asked Americans to save metal for production, but poor collectors had understood the value long before posters told them to. The trade rewarded sharp eyes. A broken appliance was not trash if it had copper. A pile of construction debris was not debris if someone knew the buyer. A city's leftovers became a map of opportunity. Over time, scrap became more regulated and consolidated. Larger yards and recycling companies squeezed out many small collectors, but the old economy never fully disappeared. Even today, before bulk trash pickup, people still cruise streets looking for metal. They are not inventing a new hustle. They are continuing an old one. Number 3. Selling alcohol during Prohibition. Prohibition is one of the clearest examples in American history of a law creating an economy. From 1920 to 1933, federal law banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. But it did not erase demand. People still wanted beer, wine, whiskey, gin, and places to drink with other people, so the market moved underground. Organized crime became famous, but ordinary people were everywhere in the system. Farmers fermented cider, families made wine, housewives brewed beer. Drivers moved bottles, bartenders poured in speakeasies, lookouts watched doors, landlords rented hidden rooms, police and politicians sometimes took bribes to look away. The Smithsonian cites a 1926 estimate from U.S. Attorney Emory Buckner that bootleg liquor sales reached $3.6 billion, roughly comparable to the federal budget at the time. That number is an estimate, but the scale is the point. When a product remains popular after it becomes illegal, the profit does not vanish. It changes hands. Prohibition created jobs without job titles: runner, guard, lookout, driver, mixer, bartender, fixer. It also created violence, corruption, poisonings, and prison sentences. The lesson is not that illegal markets are good. The lesson is that demand is stubborn. If the official economy refuses to serve it, the unofficial economy often will. Number 2. Keeping chickens and selling eggs. Egg money used to mean exactly what it sounded like. On farms and in small towns, women often controlled the chicken flock. They fed the hens, collected eggs, sold the surplus, and kept or directed the income. That money bought groceries, fabric, medicine, school supplies, household goods, and small forms of independence. Eggs were powerful because they were regular. A crop might fail. A wage job might disappear. Prices might fall. But hens kept laying if they were healthy and fed. In the 1920s and 1930s, egg production still relied heavily on farmyard and backyard systems. Large industrial poultry operations had not yet taken over the way they later would. That meant a small flock could matter. For rural women, egg money was not symbolic. It was one of the few income streams they could control directly in a world where men often controlled land, credit, and wages. The system changed as poultry production industrialized. Larger farms, specialized breeds, better feed systems, refrigeration, distribution networks, and falling prices pushed small flocks out of the commercial center. Suburban rules later restricted chickens in many residential areas. The backyard flock became a hobby or a lifestyle choice, but in the old economy, the basket of eggs was not cute. It was cash. Number 1, taking in piecework and sewing at home. The most widespread forgotten way Americans made money without a traditional job was also the quietest. Home piecework turned apartments into factories. Women and children sewed garments, finished seams, stitched buttonholes, made artificial flowers, trimmed threads, rolled cigars, assembled small goods, and completed bundles of work for contractors who paid by the piece. In New York's tenements, especially on the Lower East Side, home and workshop could be the same cramped room. A table held food at 1 hour and fabric the next. Children pulled threads. Grandmothers trimmed. Mothers stitched by weak light. After the day's domestic work was done. Reformers called it sweated labor, and often they were right. Contractors sent work into homes because it was cheap and hard to inspect. Workers absorbed the cost of space, light, heat, time, and family exhaustion. Pay was low. Hours were long. Children were drawn into labor far too young. But the story is not simple. For women who could not leave infants, sick relatives, or household duties, home piecework was sometimes the only paid work available. It was exploitation and access at the same time. Labor reform, factory regulation, and union organizing eventually pushed more production into formal workplaces. That made some work safer and more visible. It also closed one of the few income paths available to women whose lives were tied to home. There is one more truth behind the final entries. The work most likely to be forgotten was work done by people with the least power to write the record. Women working at night, children sorting scraps, black washerwomen organizing for rates, immigrant families sewing in crowded rooms, rural people digging roots, midwives crossing roads in bad weather, men selling apples because pride was all they had left. A factory leaves payroll records, a bank leaves ledgers, a corporation leaves annual reports. A woman selling pies from a basket may leave nothing but a memory in someone else's childhood. That does not mean the work was small. It means the archive was built to notice other things. So when we talk about forgotten ways Americans made money, we are also talking about forgotten evidence. The absence of a neat record is not proof that the economy did not exist. It is often proof that the people doing the work were expected to remain invisible. The old economy is built around that correction, not nostalgia, not fantasy, correction. The sewing machine in the parlor was more than furniture. It was rent, it was bread, it was medicine, it was school shoes, it was the sound of a household refusing to disappear. And that is why piecework sits at number 1. It reveals the truth behind every item on this list. Now step back from the list and look at the machine underneath it. Every item here sits between need and permission. People needed food, heat, care, cash, relief, comfort, luck, or escape. Someone found a way to provide it. Then a larger force arrived. A city department, a professional association, a corporation, a new technology, a safety campaign, a moral panic, a tax law, a zoning code, a machine, a supermarket, a state lottery, a hospital system, an industrial farm, a licensed kitchen, or a centralized factory. Sometimes that larger force made life better. It reduced disease. It standardized products. It protected buyers. It made dangerous work less common. It stopped some forms of exploitation. But it also did something else. It raised the cost of entry. A person with a basket, a room, a needle, a chicken coop, a cart, or a local reputation often could not cross the new threshold. The market did not vanish. It moved upward. The work became formal, capitalized, insured, licensed, branded, and consolidated. What had been a survival path became an industry. That is the uncomfortable lesson. Progress can solve real problems and still close real doors. The question is not whether the old ways were better. Most were not. The question is whether a society can improve safety and fairness without making the first step impossible for people who have almost nothing. Survival rarely looked like one clean job. It looked like work squeezed into every available corner. The rag picker walked before dawn. The apple seller stood in the rain. The washerwoman boiled water before sunrise. The trapper checked frozen creeks before school. The midwife crossed muddy roads at midnight. The woman with hens counted eggs like coins. The family sewing by gaslight pushed through one more bundle because tomorrow's food depended on tonight's stitches. These old ways of making money were not all noble. Some were dangerous. Some were exploitative. Some were illegal. Some disappeared because reformers had good reasons to fight them. But many did not vanish naturally. They were regulated, industrialized, consolidated, or culturally shamed out of ordinary life. And now, in a country where millions are again rethinking work, they feel strangely relevant. Not because we should return to tenement sweatshops, unsafe medicines, Skid Row blood banks, or illegal stills. We should not. They matter because they show what people do when official doors close. They sell what others waste. They rent what space they have. They cook. They mend. They gather. They haul. They care. They risk. They improvise. If you listen closely, these stories also change the way the word entrepreneur sounds. Today it often means pitch decks, venture money, software, personal brands, and polished language about scale. In the old economy, entrepreneurship often meant a widow renting a room, a boy with a shoeshine box, a woman selling food before sunrise, a family with hens, a man pushing a scrap cart, or a midwife carrying a bag down a dark road. They did not call themselves founders. They did not have logos. They did not build landing pages. But they did what business has always done at its most basic level. They found demand and met it with what they had. That does not make every hustle noble. It does not turn desperation into romance. It simply returns dignity to the act of beginning small. A society that only respects work once it becomes formal misses the hardest part of work, the beginning. There is a final reason these methods feel so distant now. The old economy lived close to the body. You could see the work. You could smell the laundry boil. You could hear the sewing machine. You could feel the cold coming off the ice wagon. You could watch the shoeshine brush move. You could see the apple seller standing in weather that made everyone else hurry indoors. Modern work often hides the body. Money moves through screens. Labor arrives through delivery routes, warehouses, call centers, server farms, payment systems, and subcontracting chains most customers never see. The distance makes work look cleaner than it is, but every economy still depends on bodies. Someone lifts, someone waits, someone cleans, someone risks injury, someone absorbs uncertainty. Someone does the work that lets other people call their own lives convenient. That is why old footage matters. A photograph of a bread line tells you something a spreadsheet cannot. A factory shot tells you that production was heat, metal, rhythm, and danger before it was a quarterly number. A boarding house was not an abstract housing solution. It was strangers sleeping under one roof because money had to be stretched. A woman taking in sewing was not a charming domestic scene. It was a negotiation with hunger after the children went quiet. The danger in remembering the old economy is nostalgia. The danger in forgetting it is arrogance. Nostalgia says the past was better because people were tougher. That is false. Many people were tough because the world gave them no choice. Arrogance says the past has nothing to teach because its tools were crude. That is also false. The tools were crude, but the instincts were sharp. Waste nothing, diversify income, keep useful skills, know your neighbors, build trust before you need it, turn space into revenue, turn seasons into opportunity, and never assume the official job market is the only market that exists. Those lessons do not require returning to unsafe work. They require admitting that resilience was once distributed through households, streets, kitchens, barns, boarding rooms, and workshops. When all survival has to pass through formal systems, the people outside those systems become invisible faster. That is why this history matters now, not as a manual to copy exactly, but as a warning. If a society makes every small beginning illegal, unaffordable, or humiliating, it should not be surprised when people stop believing the economy was built for them. The old economy was full of hard bargains, but it also preserved a simple belief. Even when the main road was closed, there might be a side door. The old economy was not romantic. It was hard, unequal, and often unfair. But it was also proof of something modern systems keep underestimating. When people are willing to work, they will search for a way to begin. The question is whether society gives them a door or forces them to build one out of scraps. If this kind of history is what you want more of, subscribe to The Old Economy. The next story is already buried in the archives.